In a world where we often expect things to unfold according to our desires, there are moments that call for us to recognize that life's beauty and meaning do not emerge on our schedule, but in the fullness of time, in a manner divinely appointed. This is the story of a flower of patience, and of a faith that sustains us as we wait for the right season to arrive. It was late in the afternoon, and the golden sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long, gentle shadows across the hills and valleys. Jesus and his disciples had been walking for hours, traveling from village to village, sharing messages of hope, faith, and the love of God. Now, as evening approached, they found rest beneath the wide-spreading branches of an ancient olive tree, its gnarled trunk a silent witness to the generations that had come and gone under its shade. The air was warm and still, heavy with the fragrances of wild thyme and lavender that grew abundantly across the rocky terrain. Birds could be heard in the distance, their calls faint against the quiet peace of the countryside. Yet, despite the beauty around them, there was a tension, an unspoken weariness that settled among the disciples. They had followed their teacher faithfully, but many of them were troubled, carrying with them a weight of unanswered prayers, of uncertainties about their future, and doubts about whether their own lives would bloom into the fullness they had hoped for. Some were tired of waiting for the promises they had heard so often from Jesus. They longed for the kingdom he spoke about, for the day when justice would prevail and peace would reign. But their journey had been long, and the answers they sought seemed always just beyond their reach. Each disciple bore his own secret hope, his own quiet frustration with the waiting. Jesus, sitting quietly among them, noticed their restless spirits. He could see the longing in their eyes and the questions that lingered unspoken on their lips. With the wisdom that had always flowed from him, he knew that now was the time to teach them a lesson that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. After a moment of stillness, Jesus stood and walked a few paces away from where they were gathered. His eyes fell on a patch of wildflowers growing nearby. Most of the flowers were in full bloom, their delicate petals open wide, reaching eagerly toward the warmth of the sun. But amid this patch of color, there was one plant that stood alone, its buds still tightly closed, resisting the gentle pull of the sunlight. Turning to his disciples, Jesus spoke softly, yet his voice carried with it the weight of eternal wisdom. "Do you see that flower over there?" he asked, gesturing toward the solitary plant. The disciples followed his gaze and saw the small plant growing from a crevice in the rocky soil. Peter, always quick to speak, was the first to respond. "Yes, Lord, I see it. It's strange, isn't it? All the other flowers have bloomed, but this one remains closed." Jesus nodded thoughtfully, a gentle smile playing across his face. "It is strange, isn't it?" he said. "But there is something important we can learn from that flower. Let me tell you a story." The disciples, who had grown accustomed to Jesus' way of teaching through stories, settled down to listen. Each of them leaned in, knowing that within his words would be the answer to the questions they hadn't yet asked. "There was once a gardener," Jesus began, "a man who loved his garden deeply. He cared for each plant with great tenderness, making sure that they had everything they needed to grow and flourish. One day he planted a small seed in a corner of his garden, in a spot that received just the right amount of sunlight and water. Every morning, the gardener would visit the seed, eager to see the first signs of life. The disciples could picture the gardener, diligent, hopeful, filled with the quiet joy that comes from nurturing something precious. In time, Jesus continued, the seed sprouted, and a small green shoot emerged from the soil. The gardener was overjoyed, for he knew that this was the beginning of something beautiful. Each day the plant grew taller, its leaves unfolding in the warmth of the sun. But as the days turned into weeks, the gardener noticed something unusual. Every other plant in the garden began to bloom, filling the air with color and fragrance. But this plant, this one he had cared for so tenderly, remained closed. Its buds stayed tightly shut, even as the flowers around it opened their petals to the light. A soft murmur rippled through the disciples. They had heard stories like this before, and each of them began to wonder where Jesus was leading them. The gardener waited patiently at first. Jesus said, his voice full of empathy. He told himself, "It will bloom in its own time. I just need to wait a little longer." But as the days stretched on, his patience began to wear thin. He watched as the other flowers flourished, their petals bright and beautiful, while his beloved plant remained closed. The gardener grew anxious. He checked the soil, the water, the sunlight. Everything was perfect. Yet still the buds would not open. The disciples nodded in understanding. How many times had they felt the same impatience, wondering why their prayers had not yet been answered, why their hopes had not yet blossomed into reality? One day, Jesus continued, the gardener, overcome with frustration, knelt beside the plant and whispered, "Why won't you bloom? What have I done wrong?" He had cared for it so well, and yet the flower refused to open. His heart grew heavy with disappointment. He had done everything he knew to do, and still the flower remained closed. Jesus paused for a moment, letting his words sink in. The disciples, now fully immersed in the story, could feel the gardener's disappointment as if it were their own. Each of them had experienced the pain of waiting for something that never seemed to come. But in the quiet of that moment, Jesus said softly, the gardener heard a voice. It wasn't loud, but it was clear. The voice came from the flower itself, and it said, "Be patient, dear gardener. I am not yet ready." The disciples exchanged glances, surprised by the sudden shift in the story. A flower that spoke? And yet, they knew that in Jesus' stories, the unexpected always carried the deepest meaning. The gardener, though puzzled, listened to the voice of the flower. Jesus said. He didn't understand why it wouldn't bloom, but he trusted what it had told him. So he continued to care for the plant, even though its buds remained closed. Days passed, then weeks, and still the flower did not open. The gardener's heart ached, but he didn't give up. He knew that something was happening, even if he couldn't see it. The disciples sat in silence, their minds turning over the meaning of the story. They thought of the unanswered prayers in their own lives, the dreams that had not yet been fulfilled. They too had waited and wondered why their heart's desires had not come to pass. And then, Jesus said, his voice full of warmth, one morning, the gardener awoke and went into his garden as he always did. But on this morning something had changed. As he approached the plant, he saw that the buds, which had remained closed for so long, had finally begun to open. Slowly, gently, the petals unfolded, revealing a flower unlike any other in the garden. Its beauty was so radiant, so extraordinary, that it took the gardener's breath away. Its petals shimmered in the morning light, and the fragrance it released was sweeter than any other flower he had ever known. The disciples were enraptured by the story now, fully caught up in the gardener's joy and the unexpected beauty of the long-awaited bloom. The gardener knelt beside the flower, Jesus continued, and tears filled his eyes. "All this time," he whispered, "I thought you would never bloom. I thought I had done something wrong, that I had failed you. But now I see that you were waiting for the perfect moment, a moment I could not have foreseen." And the flower, swaying gently in the breeze, seemed to whisper back, "I was always meant to bloom, but not when you expected. I bloomed when it was time, when I was ready, and not a moment before." Jesus let the words linger in the air for a moment, and the disciples sat in stillness, absorbing the depth of the story. They could feel the truth in his words, not just with their minds but with their hearts. Peter, who had been so quick to notice the unopened flower, was the first to speak again. But this time his voice was quieter, more reflective. "Lord," he said, "are we like that flower? Are there things in our lives that haven't bloomed yet because it's not time?" Jesus turned to Peter with a look of deep compassion. "Yes, Peter," he said, "you are like that flower. Each of you will plant many seeds in your lives, dreams, hopes, prayers. Some will bloom quickly and others will take time. You may wonder why some things seem delayed, why the answers you seek don't come as swiftly as you wish. But like the gardener, you must trust that there is a perfect time for everything. The other disciples listened intently, each of them feeling the truth of Jesus' words resonate within their own hearts. They thought of their own struggles, the things they had longed for but had not yet seen come to pass. And yet, as Jesus spoke, something shifted within them, a quiet realization that perhaps the waiting was not a punishment, but a part of the process. Jesus stood then and walked over to the small, unopened flower they had been watching. He bent down and gently touched the stem, his fingers brushing against the tightly closed buds. "Not every flower blooms when we expect it to," he said softly. "Some take longer because they are being prepared for something greater. Their beauty, their fragrance, is being shaped in the waiting. And when they finally bloom, they will be more glorious than you can imagine." The disciples felt a deep stillness settle over them, as if the very air around them had become sacred. They thought of the dreams they had carried in their hearts, the hopes they had held onto for so long, and the doubts that had grown like weeds in the soil of their souls. And yet, as they listened to Jesus, they began to see the waiting not as a burden, but as a holy journey, a journey of faith, trust, and quiet transformation. Tears welled up in the eyes of some of the disciples, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming comfort and hope that filled their hearts. They felt a deep peace, a peace that came from knowing that their waiting was not in vain, that their unanswered prayers were not forgotten. The things they longed for would come in their own time, in God's time. And when they did, they would be more beautiful, more radiant, than anything they could have imagined. Jesus turned back to them, his eyes filled with love. "Remember this, my friends," he said. "The flower that does not bloom today is not forgotten. It is simply waiting for its appointed time. And when it blooms, it will be more glorious than you could have ever imagined. Have faith, not in your own timing but in God's." And so, the disciples sat together in the fading light of the day, the gentle breeze brushing their faces, gazing at the flower that had not yet bloomed, trusting now more than ever that when it finally did, it would be in its perfect, appointed time. This is end of the story. Comment amen if you believe in Jesus' blessings. Please like this video and subscribe this channel for more Jesus story like this. May the God watch over you.